All right, thank you. Can I just start with a bit of audience participation? How many people here actually own a cryptocurrency? More than one? Less than one. All right. So okay. So there's basically only two sorts of rooms I talk to. One rooms where no one's hand goes up, and rooms where everyone's hand goes up. Those of you who have been following this particular phenomena will be aware that this is the best performing asset class 3 years running in the world, in the history of the world even. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm not going to talk about cryptocurrencies or even the underlying technology behind this. I want to talk about why this matters, why this is a thing, why this is not going away, why this is going to make the world look very different. So, as Phil mentioned, I'm Jason Potts. I'm an economist. I specialize in new technologies. I'm an innovation economist, and that's the reason that I got into this space, is that blockchain technology, distributed ledger technology, is a new technology. So it was obviously on my radar, along with a whole bunch of other new technologies. And we've been studying these things. We're studying 3D printing and AR and VR and just all the fun new things. And blockchain was another one of those things we were studying. But what became apparent is that this technology is not like the other technologies. Before this, I would study doing creative industries technologies and lasers and electricity and just a whole, innovation economists just study technology. And the reason we do that is we're interested in studying the nature and causes of long-run economic growth. And the thing about new technologies is they all more or less work the same way. When you study the economics of new technology, you don't actually really care that much about the specific new technology. What you're interested in is the impact of technology, big T, on the economy, big E, boom, boom. And the pattern that we more or less see is new technologies cause economic growth through their impact on innovation, which is a process of the new idea comes along and then it diffuses through this logistic S-shaped diffusion curve. Early adopters come in, later adopters come in after that, bit of transformation, a new thing, better, faster, cheaper. So most technologies, or in our experience up until this point, all new technologies, from the steam engine through electric motors, through vaccines, through computer chips, through mobile phones, all more or less behave the same way. There's a diffusion curve, there's an initial adoption point, and the only thing that's interesting is how fast. Right? And some of them, steam engines, 80 years. Electric motors, 70 years. Computer chips, 60, 50 years for that full transformation to happen. Up until a few months ago, basically, the fastest one we'd ever seen was cell phones. That was 12 years, more or less from initial breakthrough of the early adopters to mass penetration and the subsequent transformation of the underlying industries and things behind it. So when we first started following blockchain, we sort of had it on this map of, wow, this one's moving fast. It didn't exist in 2009. It literally did not exist. It was a whole series of component parts known only to a handful of mathematicians, cryptographers, game theorists, and a few others. It was a pure theoretical construct. And it wasn't even invented, blockchain wasn't invented to create the blockchain. Blockchain was invented as a kind of hack to solve another problem, which was how do we get digital money? And digital money had been a thing that had been, people have been trying to develop this for a few decades, and every time just failed horribly, because the problem with digital money is it's digital, which means it's really easy to copy, which means it's a really bad quality to have in money, because the ability to effortlessly counterfeit that's a bug. It's not a feature at all. That's just bad money. So blockchain was invented as the solution to create the world's first cryptocurrency. And a cryptocurrency is digital money that works. And a cryptocurrency is basically money that works on a distributed ledger, and we've now got digital money in the world. It's called cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin was the world's first cryptocurrency, and the thing that enabled that cryptocurrency to work was blockchain technology. And so that's the origin of it. The person, Satoshi Nakamoto, who we still don't know who it, she, they are, could be AI, could be a person, could be several peoples, could have been an alien drop that just as they went past just gave it to us. It's a weird technology in the sense that we don't know who built it. It's not protected. It's just there for us to use. We can't thank them for it. We can't ask them to explain what they had in mind. We just do know that they didn't really intend what has subsequently happened. So that was 2009. We're 2017 now. And what happened was that the initial sort of this technology emerged as an accidental byproduct of another thing, digital money. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not here to talk about digital money and cryptocurrencies. I'm here to talk about why blockchain is actually a different technology to all the others. And it's moving faster than all the others. As I said, the valuation of this technology is the world's best performing asset class ever. But none of those things are the most interesting thing about it. The most interesting thing about it is this is the type of technology that we don't see very often. It's not a better, faster, cheaper, take the things we already have and make them more productive, and therefore, now with added computers, or now with added horsepower, or now with lower cost. The nature of this technology is what we eventually, and this is the reason we started becoming obsessed with it. This is the first one for a very long time, and I think about 500 years, since we've seen one that is genuinely an institutional technology or a governance technology. And what that means is that what this one does is it changes how we do things. It changes how we organize our societies. It's a technology for building economies, and that's the thing I want to try and explain to you this morning. So it's a different technology to the others. Where did we go? There it is. The significance, past 3 years, best performing asset class in the world ever. Our story actually doesn't begin 3 years ago or even in 2009. Our story actually begins 5,000 years ago. 5 things happened simultaneously about 5,000 years ago. We got writing, we got numbers, we got money, we got economies, and we got government. All more or less, those 5 technologies all emerged more or less simultaneously about 5,000-ish years ago, whenever we decided to start the beginning of history. Before history, there wasn't writing, there wasn't government, there wasn't economies, there wasn't people coming together to organize their activities to create value, and there wasn't governments. That beginning was the beginning of ledgers, the ability to record, using numbers, the basic facts of who owns what, who is a what, who has what. Once we could record that with numbers, using writing, and then we could have the beginning of governance and economies. That happened a long, long time ago. It's the beginning of everything that we know. That was the beginning of ledger technology. Blockchain is a new ledger technology. That's the thing I want to connect up here. What we had was, for the next 3,000-4,000 years, the development of kingdoms, nation-states, powerful governments, controlling and using these ledgers to create essentially centralized trust. Trust in the ledger, trust in the king, in the recording of these facts. And with that came taxation. Ledgers enable a centralized unit, a government, to record who exists in the kingdom, to record how much they owe the government, to create, therefore, infrastructure and public goods, to create economies. All right? The next sort of shift in this ledger, so that was initial ledger technology, gives us centralized control and power. The next sort of shift in this happened around the 14th century, which was the invention of double entry bookkeeping. And what double-entry bookkeeping was a new ledger technology that enabled us to verify the ledger without trusting the king. We could use accounting just to cross-check the entries that go into the ledger about who owns what, who is a what just transacted. That shift in ledger technology gave us capitalism, gave us the ability to raise finance, gave us the ability to do big private ventures. That gave us the beginning of our modern world. So first, ledger technology gives us government and economy. Second shift in ledger technologies gives us the ability to raise capital, finance, and organization. Third shift in ledger technologies happened through the 20th century when we took centralized double-entry ledgers and we digitized them. So now we've got databases and spreadsheets. That enabled us to take a thing and do it much bigger, much faster. Now we can build global capitalism. Now we can put a whole lot of other technologies into this to run very large organizations very efficiently, so, which gave us the world from the beginning of the 20th century to the present. Global population increased sevenfold, wealth, just the modern world in three shifts in ledger technology. Centralization gives us economies. Double entry gives us verification and the ability to audit, which means we can use maths to do, or accounting to organize our economies. Third gives us digital gives us the power to power this up on a global scale. That's the modern world. And what is interesting about that whole technological trajectory that takes us from the Stone Age to the modern world in one technological continuity is one thing never changed. All of those ledgers were centralized. They were all in one place. And whoever held that ledger had a lot of power. Governments, large corporations. And correspondingly, how we've organized our societies is that we've needed to constrain that power, control that power. So we have democracy, we have voting to control governments, we have regulation, legislation to control corporations, we monitor, we have media to keep an eye on everything. We have all of these massively powerful and absolutely necessary technologies to control the trust that we have because of the design of these ledgers. They're all centralized. And that works. Centralized ledgers are fast and massively effective, and they've given us our modern world. What happened in 2009 was not just the beginning of a solution to digital money. That was what Satoshi Nakamoto thought they were doing. What it has turned out, and it didn't reveal itself for a few years, more or less until the beginning of another company called Ethereum, when we realized that the entries in these distributed ledgers didn't correspond to just the 1, 2, 3 meant 1 Bitcoin, 2 Bitcoin, 3 Bitcoin. Those were digital entries, which meant they were data. Anything that is digital data can now exist on a blockchain. Everything that is digital data can exist on a blockchain. What happened through the 20th century is we figured out ways of turning most of our economies into digital data. The big thing that's happened prior to this is the internet and computers, when we figured out ways of taking our economies and value and moving it onto computers and then onto the internet. The next sort of phase in this is everything that we just did that to, we can now move onto the blockchain. And sometimes blockchain technology is represented as the next generation of the internet. What's interesting is that next generation isn't a better, faster, cheaper step change. It's a fundamental shift in the architecture of our economies, societies, governments. It's a shift from centralized ledgers with all of their enormous qualities and problems. The qualities are the ability to build economies on them. The problems are we need to constrain the power that creates, the necessity to trust that centralized power. We don't have to do that anymore. And that's the shift that has just happened. And going by the scale of what happened when previous shifts happened in the fundamental technology of ledgers upon which we build economies, that's the basic argument for why our team is so convinced that this is a step change in global economies. This is not just a new fad of cryptocurrency, enormously fun speculative asset that it is. This is a step change in the underlying architecture of not how money works, but how economies work. So that's what's just changed. And what this means is we're now moving away from this. And what we need to do is appreciate how deep this goes. So this is not just power centralized in government. So just to remind ourselves that what is in ledgers? All identity is in ledgers. This is births, deaths, marriages, records, just who exists. Everything that exists in an economy exists because it is in a ledger. That ledger is controlled fundamentally by that thing which we trust the most, which is government. And we all have to trust it in order to have these things in the ledger. That gives us a foundation of the tax system, the identity management system, which is then piggybacked on by enterprise and corporate. So whenever you open a bank account, you need proof of identity. That proof of identity goes back to these ledgers. So the entire sort of economic system of recording transactions in property registers and other ways of moving value and showing that these assets are yours. And when you move them, you had permission to move them. All of that is based upon a chain of centralized ledgers that goes all the way back. That's what's just changed, is we don't have to do it like this anymore. We've got another technology with which to do this. And what that means is, this is the significance of the point of what we're up to now in terms of trying to figure out what the implications of this are and how far we will take this. But in essence, large centralized organizations, including government, that we need to trust and therefore constrain because we need that for the way ledgers are organized in an economy, that's just shifted. All right. So what I think has happened is that we're at a tipping point now. This is not a thing that's just happened in 2009 and we're looking back after this event going, okay, that just happened. We're in the middle of it. This is like a 10 magnitude earthquake and it's a low rumble and it's still going on right now. That uncertainty you feel in these crypto markets and in this, is this a thing, is it not a thing? That's what a deep magnitude 10 earthquake feels like. This will take a while to play out. The other ones took thousands of years to play out, the first one, hundreds of years to play out the second one, decades to play out the third one. This one will probably play out faster, but we're right in the middle of it. We're at the early stages of this thing building right now. And that's why, you can tell just in the sense of this fundamental sense of uncertainty about what is actually changing. Is this a real thing? Is it not? So what I'm here to sort of suggest here is that I and my research group fundamentally believe that this is a real thing, that this is a fundamental shift. This is not a superficial change in the economy, not a superficial change like the internet was. This is a much deeper shift than that. Internet was just taking digital data and networking it. This is fundamental change in the architecture of how we organize value and record that. So that's what a blockchain is. The other sort of thing I want to add at this point is I think there's an enormous value to be had in this. We have a lot of cost and constraint in centralized ledgers that we never realized was there because we never had an alternative technology with which to develop these. So what I want to do is just walk you now through a few just particular examples of how I think this will play out, and then we can move to questions. One of the interesting aspects of this is data. At the moment, with centralized ledgers, the way data works is data has to be in the centralized ledger, right? Which means that for most important data in your life, you don't own it. And you can't own it. It can't be that way. So all of your identity records and health records and all of those sort of fundamental data about you, the way in which that works is that has to be in a centralized ledger that is controlled by a thing that we trust. And that's an efficient, good, fast way of doing it. But what it means is that we don't have property rights over data and can't have property rights over data without adding some really costly hacks to that system that more or less architecturally just don't work. That may be about to fundamentally change. With blockchain technology, in the same way that we were able to put money and currency on a blockchain, and the significance of that was, without a bank, right? That's the decentralization thing, is you can create money without a central bank. Decentralized it. You can do that with anything now, which means we can do it with digital identity. We can do it with all of your various health records, any data that you produce, going into sort of social media, all sorts of just data around property titling and assets and so on. All of that data can move to the blockchain. The significance of that is that we've fundamentally changed the architecture of how it works. Technically, it's making it peer-to-peer. We can now just move it through a network without it passing through a central auditing, clearing, validating node, a government, a centralized ledger. But the significance of that is we've just now created markets where we didn't have markets before. This could well be an explosion. This technology could open an explosion of data markets, which will fundamentally change how identity works, how property registers and transfer works, how anything of value, where we need to know who owns this, who has permission to move this thing, who has permission to access this thing, how that works. And then that moves through industry by industry. So at the moment, we're working through the implications of digital money. This is the payments which is affecting fintech, and for the most part, this new technology is disrupting finance right now, and they're sort of starting to realize that they can use this effectively. That's just the beginning, and that's actually almost the most superficial part of it. The deeper parts are when it starts to disrupt how personal data works, and then how that moves around. Now, once you sort of see that, then you start to see that this technology can be used for rebuilding social organization, how we create governance for organizations. The next aspect of this, so we can put money on the blockchain, we can put data on the blockchain. Another example of data is code. We can put software on the blockchain. If we can put software on the blockchain and we've got value on the blockchain, we've got the ability to put smart contracts on the blockchain. This is the ability to create organizations called decentralized autonomous organizations on the blockchain. That's a way to rebuild organizations and governance in a way that these things do not rely on centralized ledgers. They're fully autonomous. An example is when you think sort of self-driving cars. The interesting thing about self-driving cars are amazing. Robot technology and AI and VR and all sorts of really interesting things. The most mind-blowing part of this technology is the bit that hasn't happened yet, which is that self-driving car could own itself on the blockchain. It'll have legal identity, it'll have the ability to contract, it'll have its own bank account, it'll make its own economic decisions. It will own itself. When it needs repaired, it'll go and find someone to contract with to fix it. It'll then have to decide what to do with the money it creates. That is what can happen on this. That's the next sort of step in terms of these new technologies having the qualities that previously only economic agents and humans have had before. That now goes from weird, impossible science fiction thing to trivially obvious. So we're going to see a lot of these sort of shifts. And what these shifts look like is they're not the better, faster, cheaper type of shifts in the economy. They're the sort of shifts that will impact the very organization or the very sort of way in which we think about how economies work and what exists in an economy. So first lesson, or first sort of implication, is that if we're right about this story I'm telling here, the role of government will change. Previously, the essential role of government was managing and creating ledgers, and because it could do that, it could do other things. It could do redistribution, it could do taxation, it could do regulation, it could do all of these other things that it could do because it controlled the centralized ledgers. And we needed it to do that, so it was necessary. We have large organizations as the most efficient way to organize any industry that is data intensive. Think health, think media, think insurance. That sort of very large global spanning organization is economically efficient because centralized ledgers. Because you want a single ledger when you're organizing a banking system or a media system, you need a single centralized ledger is the most effective way to do it. And that's why global capitalism has the shape it does in terms of large global spanning organizations doing the running of things and then smaller ones doing the inventing of new things. That could be about to change, in the sense that we don't need to have it like that anymore. Now, it might still, I'm not going to be as bold as to predict exactly what the shape of this will look like, but the sort of economic efficiency and necessity of those architectures, the way modern taxation works cannot survive this. It will have to be reinvented in different forms. My guess will be we're at the end of income tax. This will have to move to some kind of consumption tax system, and it will have to operate on a far more global scale. Which means that nation states are now, at least from the economic regulatory taxation perspective, are going to be they're going to need to be redeveloped. The way law works and the way regulation works is going to shift. We can now hard code regulation into software, into smart contracts. That's a theoretical possibility now. It's about to become, as this develops, we won't have regulatory agencies that sit off to the side monitoring and auditing a thing that's happening over here. We'll actually build these directly into the software itself. That's interesting in the sense that the way in which organizations govern and regulate themselves will actually be hard-coded in software rather than monitored by agents that we elect from the outside. So regulation, law, governance, taxation are all about to be profoundly disrupted in terms of how they work in this. So this is the sort of scale at which I think that this magnitude 10 earthquake is this is why this is not just, and now we've got new money along with the old money to speculate on. This is a fundamental shift in the architecture of how we organize economies. I think it's more than that. If you can just indulge me a few more minutes just to wrap this up in terms of why it's beyond that. So that's sort of economic, corporate, industrial transformations and the interaction with government. This is a born global technology. This is not a technology that sits naturally inside a nation state. This is something that right from the beginning, and this was the intention. The intention of it was to create a global money that could completely bypass governments. That was the crypto-anarchist intention of it. Again, the actual reality of it is not quite that. But one of the first major implications of what this sort of technology means for global society is it's not just about how to get money out of Venezuela or how to move capital without government seeing it and taxing it. The other side of this is the ability for the 1 to 3 billion people who are more or less shut out of finance and because of broken governments, because they live in a society where their centralized ledger for identity and everything that's built on that just doesn't work or is crazily inefficient. Because that ledger doesn't work, they find it hard to access property and finance and insurance and all of the other things that we take for granted that are necessary to create wealth and go out. So we saw the impact that cell phones have had on the developing world. It's profound. It just enabled that sort of leapfrogging technology that enabled mobile communications to bring markets to places that never had markets. That's just a tiny thing compared to what this will do. This doesn't just bring communications. This brings infrastructure, economic infrastructure to places that have missed out on those. So, this is again why I'm sort of very optimistic about the transformative power of this technology is it potentially brings governance. I say governance, not government, governance, and the powers of that to potentially billions of people that have never benefited from that before, but have got the infrastructure now. They've got cell phones. That's all you need. Smartphones, and if you have smartphones, you can be part of this revolution. All right, so I mentioned data markets as sort of one aspect of this. The challenges that we've got here. This is new. The way the technology is developing right now, we're still struggling with scale. It was never designed to work at a global level. It was designed to work, there's 21 million bitcoins. They're rapidly being used up. There's 1,000 other alt currencies that have emerged. There's a lot of sort of new startups and things that are emerging into the space. The main issues on the technology building side are just doing this at scale. That's everything that is going on right now, is trying to figure out how to build and develop this technology to make it twice as big, 10 times as big, 100 times as big. That's that side of it. What I've seen, I go to these conferences, it's tech conferences on this all the time. It's being developed. There's smart people are working on this and pushing this technology forward. On the other side, governments are looking at this and panicking, which is good, because that means they're paying attention. The worst case is when they're looking at it and then just ignoring it. Australia isn't. Australia is in the vanguard of countries and governments that are trying to figure out how to address this and deal with this. Some countries, like China, for example, have panicked and have tried to outlaw it all and push away. Other countries like Singapore, Sweden, Britain have fully embraced it and just gone, this is the future, and are trying to rapidly convert their economies as quickly as possible into that space by essentially moving government onto the blockchain. Australia's, it's not quite as enthusiastic, but we're there. But what this means is redesigning tax systems, trying to develop regulatory frameworks in this space, trying to figure out what fundamentally has to change. The other big thing, which is perhaps more for the people in this room, is that this is going to profoundly impact commerce and industry and how we strategically think about these things. And it's not obvious that all this is just there's not a comet coming in to destroy you. This is a fundamental new technology that will radically transform and create enormous amounts of value. The point is just not to get killed by it as it happens, and to come out the other side stronger, faster, better. And I think the point of what I was hoping to get across today was that the first thing in doing that is to realize what is actually changing, just to get the framing right here. That this isn't a new technology that you adopt. This is a fundamental re-architecture of how things work. And I think this is, the starting point of that is to realize that what just changed is the way in which ledgers and therefore data, the information upon which economies are built, the technology of that has just changed. And that's the thing that we're sort of trying to work through. So I'll finish there and open up to questions. But my message for you today is that this is a thing that is important not just to read up on, but to think deeply about, and about how you can take advantage of this and try and lead this shift. Thank you.
So, Joseph, thank you for that. Like a fish, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, has anyone like to open some questions that come with that? Please.
What is the impact of this could be on democracy and democratic election of government?
Yeah. So there's two ways to look at this. The first way is that we can use this technology for voting, to fix voting, right? So the way in which this is being rolled out is that the first problem is identity. First, we have to put people's identity on the blockchain, which enables you to essentially, so that solves the problem of, basically voting will be like spending a Bitcoin. You can, but it's a spend once only coin, right? So we can identify who is voting and enable them to do this fully on the blockchain, which gives us security. We know, so voter fraud and the cost of doing so disappears. So moving money to the blockchain was the same problem as moving voting to the, moving money onto the internet had the sort of the same problems as moving voting onto the internet for the same reason. Double spending problem is the double voting problem, and that was why electronic voting has always been problematic. Fixed it, done. So we can vote on blockchains. For Australia, that's a minor improvement. For some countries around the world, that's a game changer. We can now go from rigged democracy to actual democracy. So big deal there. The far more interesting aspect of this, though, is why we would need to vote at all. The reason we vote is to appoint a representative. The best democracy is direct democracy. We don't have direct democracy, we have representative democracy. What representatives do is they pass laws and act on your behalf in order to contract with, say, the civil service to deliver public services. So what happens is government is this thing that sits between citizens and that which delivers public goods and services, the civil service and other infrastructure public good providers. Why can't we just go direct? We might not actually need those representatives anymore if we can enable groups of citizens. So when it's just you contracting someone to do a stuff, that's a market. What government is a group of people contracting a thing to do a thing. We can do that now. This is a technology for doing that. That group of people can come together, they can govern themselves with smart contracts and essentially form an organization, a coalition, and that coalition can then negotiate and contract directly with the civil service. And so this is the sort of potential game changer that this brings. So that's political fiction I just described there. But that's entirely within the ambit of this technology. And this is the way in which what we can do then is, instead of having a nation state or a state organization or a city organization, these political groupings can basically self-form. And that could be a group of people in your neighborhood. It could be a group of people with similar need for public goods around the world. It could be a religious grouping. It could be a cultural grouping or whatever. But just whenever a group of people comes together to need publicly provided or jointly provided services, for the last 5,000 years we've had one mechanism to do that, government. We've now got two. We can do this with smart contracts and direct things. So I think the potential profound shift here could be much larger than we initially think.
Thank you. Anybody else like to ask anything?
I've just got maybe a bit of a dumb question, but as I understand it today, to use blockchain, you need a key or a password or something, or to keep something on a memory drive. Is there some way, and that seems potentially a problem in the future, like if I'm a person, random person, and I lose that, and that's my entire identity. Is there?
Yeah, no, that's a real thing. Whether you think of this as a feature or a bug depends on whether you're a software developer or a human being. But the software developers are all like, no, this is good. This is like awesome. Now I've got my... So how the technology works is it's called public key encryption. And it's how you spend a coin, how coins move around is the coin doesn't move around. The numbers don't move around in the ledger. What happens is you hand around a set of keys to access the ledger, access the ability to spend a coin. The coin stays in the same place. What moves around is permission to access this thing. That's how you send money to someone else, is you give them your keys, or you give them access to keys. And then what the consensus algorithms are doing is just making sure that you did have permission to give those keys on. And that's what the chain is this chain of just keeping track of who had permission to do a thing. So what the whole, the nature of what just happened in terms of how the technology works is that the centralized thing is you have access, you're given permission to access a thing, and which is why a centralized ledger can always be audited and re-audited. It's quite easy. So if you make a mistake, it's like just go back to the thing. At the moment, and this is a problem, and this is so much money has been lost by people losing their keys and not really realizing that you have to look after them yourself. In terms of keeping track of these huge long strings of hexadecimal numbers. So at the moment, it really does, it works badly. It's horrible. What is likely to happen is we'll just develop better technologies of key management. There's an enormous amount of money on the table for any company or startup that can develop better ways of doing that. We may develop, we may try and embed these things into, I don't know, optical scan. I don't know, but it's a problem. We'll probably solve this with more technology, but it's a real problem right now. It's a real trap for beginners to come in and lose their keys on this. And what happens if you lose your keys? It's gone. There's no one you can appeal to. There's no call up the bank and go, can you reset my thing? Gone. I think, what is it? Something like an estimate of 5% of all Bitcoins are just gone in this respect, which is, a non-trivial problem. But it's a thing that can be solved with more technology.
Hi, Ron.
Jason, how do you ensure that the validation or the data that's going on is the truth? More from a government
So this is another big aspect that that people in this space are worrying about is the thing about a blockchain ledger is it's what's called an append-only database. Right? So the databases that you're thinking of or might be familiar with, such as an Excel spreadsheet, is a writable database. You can put something in, and then you can write over the top of it, and what was previously there is gone. You've got the new thing. A blockchain isn't like that. A blockchain is once it's in, it's in. And all you can do is add more data to it, but you can never remove data. Once it's in, it's in. Which means that it really matters that what is in is true. How do we... So that's why this is a crucial, important, fundamental issue. What this now looks like is that this is why the technology of oracles, the technology of sort of essentially third-party management of how we put things into the database, the technology of monitoring and providing bounties on discovery of false data in those things now becomes a thing. But again, this is the new architecture that we're moving to has this problem. Don't lose your keys. How do we know that the data in there, that is in there forever now, is good and true? But if we discover bad data, we can correct it by adding more data over the top, pointing back to that thing. So this just becomes part of the new world that we live in, is we now have these problems instead of... So trade these off, right? So we don't have power problems anymore. We've got these problems instead. We've got data management problems. Choose. Right? So the extent to which these ones overwhelm the other one will determine, I think, the shape of how this is likely to unfold. My guess is that these are solvable problems. The previous one was permanent. We just had to build other things to control it. We couldn't make it go away. So, yeah, but these are the problems we've got right now. Scale, don't lose your keys, is it true? Oh, yeah. What will not be visible is who did that vote. It'll be visible that someone did that vote, someone with that address did that vote, but you can't tell who that is. So this is like, you can see every transaction that ever happened on the Bitcoin blockchain, you just can't tell, and you can see the amount it was for, and you can see where it went to, you just can't tell who any of those people are, people or things. So blockchain is a number of technologies. And one of the technologies, so one of them is public key cryptography. Another one is asymmetric cryptography, which is otherwise called a hash function, which takes a long string of data, runs it through a hash function, which is just some mathematical magic, and outputs a fixed length string, which is also a key. And the property of that is it's asymmetric. You can go from this to this effortlessly. This back to this will take 1 billion years of computation. So this is why people are worried about quantum computers and the security of this, is that might speed that up a bit, from 1 billion years to 1 million years or something. But so just the security of that, the privacy and security of this is so much better, infinitely better, than the current system we have of centralized databases where lots of people have access to this. So your health records are accessible, not necessarily to you, but to a lot of others, to health workers, people that you trust. Your criminal records are not necessarily accessible to your fellow citizens, but they are to a bunch of police officers and others who have access to that, and we need to trust them. So the current system we've got is actually pretty leaky and problematic. And this one, the new system here, is massively counterintuitive in how you get data security. You get data security by making it enormously public, but then protected under this layer of hash functions. And if we trust in the cryptography that those asymmetric elliptic curve hash functions are unbreakable, then the security is that we can all verify everything. We just can't tell what's there. That's sort of one of these things that it takes a bit of time to get through, and it's worth working through that, spending a few hours trying to sort of get to the bottom of that one. The other thing, just on your point, was so that's the sort of privacy security aspect. The other aspect of this is the way in which blockchains work in providing assurance of the validation of the ledger, and how do we know that this is all good and it's been audited, and that bit doesn't work through cryptography. That bit works through economic incentives. So you might have heard of miners, of cryptocurrency miners. What those miners are doing are responding to very high-powered economic incentives. Every time they do some mining, they get some coin. And what those miners are doing is they're not mining, they're auditing. They're going through and they're just making sure that every transaction is the good one, and if they only get paid if they back only true transactions, valid transactions. If they try and mine and back and put forward another block that's got some false transactions in it, what happens is that they now will not get the coin that they're mining for. And that high-powered economic incentives is where the security comes from. It's basically economically not worth it to try and push through invalid transactions. So the privacy comes from cryptography, but the security of how do we trust that this is good is actually an economic incentive. So that's the economic incentives are actually another one of the technologies that Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever you are, built into this. And again, a very surprising input. We wouldn't have thought to use economic incentives for database security.
Do you want to tell that bit further forward when we talked yesterday about the bounty? Bounty hunters, excuse me.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah,
It's
sorry.
not the chocolate bar.
Yeah, so okay, so this is we're going to join a few dots here. I've sort of talked about how we don't need government to do the things that it does anymore in the same way. We still need governance. We still need security. We still need validation. We still need everything to work. So the question is, how do we create high-powered incentives to monitor, police, run these types of distributed governance mechanisms with still that have law and politics and stuff in them? The centralized system is that we have government that then appoints agents to do so, the police, the courts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's our late capitalism model. The world that we're possibly about to enter, if we're right about the directions that we're pointing here, might not look so much like, imagine the 20th century, but even more so, but might look more like, imagine a really high-tech version of the 17th century. And this is like, but without all the plague and without all the suffering and bad teeth. But with some of the interesting features of the sort of pre-Enlightenment Western Europe, where you had things like bounty hunters, which is the connection here. And so, I mean, how you can create sort of security and enforcement in this space is we could actually potentially just create, at the moment miners are working for coin. We can incentivize and create security for lots of things working for coin. But instead of having those things as public servants, they can effectively be bounty hunters that are going after rewards for finding bad transactions or for finding violations of something or for finding bad data on the internet. We just simply post rewards for finding anything that we don't want in there. And it's a decentralized system, anyone can go after it. So, we kind of have little bits of this with sort of government contracting, but imagine that for a whole lot of other stuff. And again, we can do this because of the way in which the economic security incentives and smart contracts work within this. So just, again, the message that I'm sort of pushing out here is what has just shifted is the fundamental architecture of how we do a lot of things has just, we've now got a new technology for this. Most of what I've talked about is speculative, but the actual technology exists now. We just have to figure out what to do with it and what the trade-offs are, what we're willing to tolerate in terms of risk, in terms of losing your keys, whether the existing the existing system we have in terms of security and privacy is actually pretty bad at the moment. We're just used to it being bad. A blockchain system would actually be far better, but it brings new challenges and also new ways of sort of doing things. So yeah, lots of significant shifts on the horizon.
Carol, so I'll come to you. We've got about another 5 minutes, so if we get 2 questions, it'd be good.
So I'm very impressed with the presentation. We've looked at the positive side of this thing, and one of the challenges for society when you look at corruption, and poverty, etc., is that to make the economies efficient, you have complete governance and transparency with this capability. But you could also use this capability as a black market in having closed the network that is doing dodgy stuff as well. And because it's so secure, and once you get into the black market, then you may stop the good side, I guess, getting into it as well. So in the long term, you could end up, and maybe I'm just speculating, with 2 sets of economies or multiple virtual worlds in this space that allows dodgy stuff to happen. So what are the implications from a security, privacy, governance on preventing those things happening? Because I guess as human beings, we would speed at 45 km in a 40, so that could be a record. Or we might walk across the road when we're not supposed to, that could be a record as well. So and then we might say, okay, we can try and hide that matter by joining an environment that doesn't expose those things.
All right, so I've got some bad news for you. First of all, those things already exist. We already live in a world that has those things in it. What we're really talking about is the management and trade-off in this space. So, as you will all be aware, the first use case of this technology was basically buying drugs on the internet. Right? That was the starting point of all of this, which alarmed people because it seemed like, okay, now you can buy drugs. All of that stuff had already been happening. It was just there was a new technology for this. So look, in one sense, I mean, you're absolutely right. This does create a new way to a new technology for creating communities that want to disobey laws and be generally uncivilized. But my point is that's already been there. I think the real discussion here is our technologies for dealing with this, right? So the technologies for dealing with this that we've had previously are monitoring. We employ people whose job it is just to try and sniff this out and find it, and then go after them, right? Now the problem with that system is corruption. They can make their own decisions about who they go after, then you have to monitor the monitors, and so that's the centralized. So that's the world that we're. So the question is, is this new thing going to be better than that thing? Not is the new thing perfect compared to the, compared to the perfect world we already live in. What is interesting is that a lot of law enforcement agencies are very excited about this, because everything, you can see everything. You just can't tell who did it, right? Whereas the problem with a cash economy is you can see nothing. And then you have to start from trying to figure out and trace through that. So I think the main implication here is that, first of all, this is a transparency technology. You can see a lot more that's going on. The problem is trying to figure out who just did the thing. Secondly, in terms of how I discussed earlier with regulation and hard coding of regulation, is again, that's an example of what happens when you don't do monitoring, but you just basically build it in directly. So an example of this is the thing about hard-coded financial regulation into a decentralized autonomous organization would be that the 10 minutes after a bank started trading insolvent, the automatic regulation smart contract would kick in, and that bank would immediately shut down and redistribute its assets to its creditors. That whole process of insolvency, the minute it started trading insolvent, or the minute it got to the threshold, would just automatically happen, and we wouldn't need agencies coming in and monitoring that. So that's a sort of civil example of what happens when you don't do monitoring when you hard code. You were talking about a criminal example of this. But an economy that all transactions are occurring in cryptocurrency is one where you can see everything. That's actually better than a cash economy. New problem, who just did the thing, but at least we can see it. And so I think this is this isn't from a broken world to a perfect world. This is two imperfect situations, which is worse, which is better.
Okay, I've been very economic with the truth. Okay, you had your hand up, go on.
Thank you for that really good section. Really interested in your conversation about how this is going to increase trust. And one of the pieces that we've been looking at is how algorithms in Google versus algorithms in China are using different components of trust and what they're exposing. And what we're finding is China are being more transparent around their identity management, whereas Google is doing more things, similar things in their algorithms, but nudging you to certain behavior.
Okay.
So when you were talking about economies that have embraced and are more mature on their journey in this space, you talked about Singapore and UK going forward and China holding
Yep.
back, whereas I saw the capability in China actually moving forward quite a lot. So are you talking about maturity in mindset, or are you talking about capability and maturity in
Okay, two things. First of all, this isn't a technology that enables and creates trust. This is a technology that means we don't need trust. So we economize on trust. That's good, because trust is crazy expensive. We have to do all sorts of things to regulate and control. But the other point, I think, is actually sort of more immediately interesting. So when Bitcoin cryptocurrencies first came out, the first use cases beyond buying drugs on the internet was capital controls avoidance. Essentially, people with assets in Venezuela, in Russia, in places where the government didn't want them to take money out, just going, it doesn't really matter what you say, I'm taking the money out. So convert to Bitcoin, send the Bitcoin, pull the Bitcoin out in another currency, evading capital controls. So that was a great way for citizens to avoid broken governments that they didn't trust, or where the trust was broken and institutions were broken. So this is going to fix broken governments, and the more broken governments are, the better the technology. That was for payments and money. The next major use case is property titling and moving digital assets around. And here we learned something surprising. So land asset registries are an obvious ledger that you can move to the blockchain. And the place where we thought this would be obvious was sort of post-earthquake Haiti and South Sudan, and just countries with just such broken land registries that their economies were broken because that was broken. You couldn't, only the crazy rich could own property or effectively move property or defend their property and therefore gain the benefits, the economic benefits of that, and most of the poor people were just shut out of that, right? So, okay, yay, we can use this technology there. Turns out that that's just been a failure. The places in the world where we have successfully begun the process of moving land registries to the blockchain are Sweden, Estonia, one other one, Hungary, I think. Not Hungary. Anyway, Sweden. Think Sweden. Okay. The one country that doesn't need it to do that, their land registry system was working pretty good. Now it's awesome. Right? It's gone from good to awesome. And what's interesting is why that happened. Why did it not happen in Haiti, where it was broken and just we could have fixed it and that would have been so great. Instead, it didn't. Was trust. The Swedish people trusted their government to make this shift. So they could all go, all right, we're all going to do this thing. We're going to take our really valuable asset and we're going to move it to this experimental new technology. Let's hope this doesn't go horribly wrong. Trust is what got them there. So now they've got this awesome thing. So this process, once you're in the blockchain, don't need trust. Trustless technology, economizing on trust. Once you're in it, the process of getting into it needs trust. And this is why, this is the thing that I worry about the most, is that the places and regions that are likely to benefit the most from this radical new trustless technology are precisely the places where we've already got a lot of trust. New global divide that is not a divide based on education or divide based on whether you have cell phones or not, but a divide based upon those places that already have trust in government can make this transition and reap all the benefits that come from this new globalized world that they all enter. Those countries that are out of it can't get there in the first place. So we can think of it as a do you have internet, do you have digital, do you have cell phones? If yes, you can make this transition. 2, and the other thing, you also need to have a trustworthy government. And that was the bit that even last year, no one really saw. Now we see it very clearly, and that's our other concern. So Australia's in a good situation. We more or less have a trustworthy government at all levels that we can make this transition with. Not all places have that ability.
Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, just give a round of applause and thank Jason.
Thank you.